I had my first panic attack in ninth grade. It was early evening, and I just couldn't stop moving. And remember getting to this point in my mind where I was trying to conceive doing math with colors. I felt like I was going insane, and I was walking around the house. I was outside of the house at this point. I was walking around the perimeter of the house for about 30 minutes in circles, just trying to distract myself, looking for new erosion in the brick of the house on the side that I never really went over to, or rogue flowers that had not, I hadn't yet noticed. Eventually I went inside, where I continued to walk around up and down the stairs, and the circling or through the rooms continued. And I don't remember how long this went on. I don't recall that, but it was long enough for my parents to kind of look at me funny and, wonder if they should call the doctor, which they eventually did. And after some questions, he suggested that I was having a panic attack. And I ate some toast. My mom made me some cheese toast, and my dad set up the VCR to play a movie. It was probably around midnight at this point, which was super late for our house. And I was eating my cheese toast, and my dad set up the VCR to play a movie, which I chose was Swiss Family Robinson, or is it The Swiss Family Robinson? I don't know. Anyway, it was a staple in my youth, and I kind of watched it and just kind of dozed. I don't ever remember feeling tired that night. I just kind of, I think my body just flipped a switch, and I just fell asleep pretty immediately when it was time. Many moons and many panic attacks later, I'm sitting here in a kitchen in Los Angeles, and I think I want to start sharing about these experiences, but not from the standpoint of necessarily what happened, but how they've applied to my life creatively, and how they apply to how I feel about, and I think maybe am affected by, the world around me, both in the world that I choose to involve myself with and in, and the world at large, kind of what's going on in the media and our culture and all of that good stuff. I'm well aware of that. A lot of how I feel is simply due to who I am. Call it genetics, call it conditioning. But there's also this effect of the world and what is happening and what is not that stakes a claim on how I feel and how I react. There's a part of me that feels like I could turn it off. I could just ignore it and just do me, but that has never felt right. And I remember my youth, and as we all do, and I remember being younger with great innocence, not just about what was happening in front of me, but about my perceptions on the world. And there is still that there. There is still a sense of wonder. But when I think back on that, I remember how nice kind of my own ignorance felt. And maybe that's just what happens, when we get older and broaden ourselves, through our experiences, or more intentionally through what we seek. But it never felt right to turn it off. I'm well aware that a lot of how I feel and why I feel this way is simply due to who I am. Call it genetics, call it conditioning. But there's a lot of the effect of the world and what is happening in the world and what is not happening in the world that stakes claim into how I feel and react. And there's a part of me that feels like I could turn it off, ignore it all and just do me, but that has never felt right. And there's an element of vulnerability that comes with anxiety, I think. Vulnerability in our culture often accompanies ideas of weakness or powerlessness, and certainly I feel both of those things when I am in the throes of an attack. And I learned in school, in college with my acting professors and just doing that kind of work, that the idea of being vulnerable is what sets us back. But at least for this exercise of this podcast, because the world needs another one of these, I would argue that when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable is when we truly begin to take our power back. When we put that vulnerability to an action is when we take our power back. when we go to those dark places of anxiety and confusion, but we go there equipped with a scalpel to dissect with the intent to kind of use it. It's far simpler to allow vulnerability, I think, to occur behind closed doors, which, we all do, away from another beating heart. And there is value to that sometimes. I don't think we should vomit everything that's happening in our lives way out in the open for everybody to see. I personally don't think that's productive. But there's another side, that the vulnerability that is never shared with another because we spend so much time and energy constructing walls behind that vulnerability to hide behind. And we burn far more fuel attempting to convince ourselves of things that don't serve us, instead of admitting our truth and leading with that. A directing professor of mine told me that he said that anxiety is excitement left unused. And I only continue to see that as an inherent truth the older I get. And while we all have our struggles and anxieties and otherwise, this is not a time to dwell on the negative of that which ails us, I believe. Rather, I think it's imperative right now to find ways to incorporate these struggles, these anxieties, to incorporate these things into ways of expression, into the ways we express ourselves, and use them as a guide and not an excuse. So I guess in essence, that's what this experiment is about. I will be talking to people about their art, about their process, and how their anxieties have set the tone for the work that they bring to the world, and just kind of see where that takes us. So that's my little experiment here, and I am calling it Social Anxiety, Casual Conversations for the End of the World. These are usually going to have, I think, guests. I'm going to talk to people. I already talked to a friend of mine in Berlin, an artist and director. I talked to an actor here in Los Angeles and a photographer as well. And I'm going to continue to integrate people into the interviews. But for this one, for the first one, it's September 10th. And I become very reflective around this time of year, and I always have. Even as a little kid, I remember the fall, I just kind of felt like I was waking up. I felt alive. I never did well in the heat, and once it started to get cool, my brain kind of started to work a little bit better. That first panic attack was in the summer, so the heat certainly doesn't help. But I also was in New York in school on September 11th, 2001, and I become reflective this time of year because of that as well. And it's been an odd journey for me because there's a lot of conflict in how I perceive that day and how I've chosen to perceive it, whether that choosing is voluntary or involuntary. In some cases, I don't know. But I want to share a little bit about that day and kind of where it has brought me in regards to my outlook on life in general, as well as how it has affected the reason behind my art and my reason behind attempting the art I want to create. So I was staying on the Upper East Side, about 20 blocks away from the school. I was looking for an apartment at the time with my buddy Josh, and I had a morning class, and I always walked from there. You know, New York's such a great city to walk in, and it was that early, crisp fall day. It was beautiful. I got up, and I had my yellow Sony Walkman with a mixtape, and I remember coming off the side street and entering onto 2nd Avenue to walk down south towards school. About 2 or 3 blocks down is when I realized that there were no cars. There was no traffic on the road. None. The occasional ambulance or police car or fire engine would go by, but I didn't think much of it. But at that like 2 or 3 block point, I realized that, okay, something's a little weird. And I looked off into the distance and I saw a big, kind of cloud of smoke arcing out over the avenue into Brooklyn. And when I got to school, people were out front just sobbing. And I went up to the mezzanine, which was kind of this second floor above the entrance, where they had a lot of like antique furniture and stuff like that. And they had a TV set up and people were crowded in there. And the only place that I could go was on top of a dresser. So I propped myself up and sat on top of a dresser. And we watched. We watched as it happened. We watched as it fell. This woman, this administrator, came over to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, I don't think you can sit up there. It's very old." And, you know, I was an asshole, but I just looked at her and I said, "That doesn't matter anymore." And I didn't feel like an asshole. I wasn't like, "Oh, I'm feeling weird and scared, like I'm going to be an asshole right now." That wasn't it. It was just, there was a sense that history had been erased and my history was starting in this moment. Even though I hadn't fully conceived what was going on, you know, I knew enough, and the feeling in the room was enough to know that something big was shifting. And, you know, I continued the day, you know, just kind of hung out with friends, and, you know, I was at the school for about another hour and a half, and all the subways and everything shut down. So when I finally decided to go back up to where I was staying, I walked down to the avenue from school and turned back onto 2nd Avenue to walk north. And tens of thousands of people looking right, looking left, silence. Walking, but just silent. I joined, you know, the ranks, if you will, and walked north, and it was just very quiet. Can't really hear footsteps in New York, and you could hear them for blocks, for many blocks. I certainly did not turn my music back on. I saw a woman with a stroller, and the baby was just kind of oblivious to everything that was going on, and she was screaming, asking for somebody to, you know, if they had a cell phone that worked, because the cell phones weren't working or they were jammed. I didn't talk to my family for a while because of that. And I saw another guy come out of Lenox Hill who was wearing like a doctor's coat and just vomit onto the curb. And maybe just had a lot of anticipation for this onslaught of bodies that never showed up. And then I went to where I was staying and just kind of gathered myself. And that night I went out and the city was electric. Every restaurant, every bar, people were just packed in there, falling out onto the sidewalk, and not drunk, but just so many people were out. And there was this sense of peace that I had never felt before. And that sense of peace continued for about 2 or 3 months leading up into the holidays, where New York was different. People had their heads up. They were willing. And I feel like for myself during this time, I had a glimpse of how we could be with each other. You know, New York has so many different people with so many different agendas and so many different backgrounds and creeds and all of that stuff. But it is the perfect example of a place where you can live and not have to share opinions to share a common purpose. You have to, on some level, share a common purpose to live there, even if it's just from kind of an energetic standpoint. Later that night, I went up to the roof of where I was staying as then the sun was setting and the sky was very orange. I was smoking a cigarette, looking south, and I could see the smoke still going out over into Brooklyn, and there was ash flying around me. And I had this thought, was that somebody's sweater or somebody's desk or somebody's parent earlier that day? And it was sad. The next few months, I was involved in a play in school, and the way the director had it, when we weren't in a scene, we were sitting on stage. It was a play about the French Revolution where I played a sex-hungry rapist executioner. And when I wasn't in the scene, we would be sitting on the stage in some place, and my place was to sit alongside the proscenium. The audience was right there, and the action on the stage was on the other side. And I remember having full-blown panic attacks. My ears would start ringing, and I would kind of be reliving a lot of things, and I would have full-blown panic attacks during that performance. But I think that was the first time in my life where they didn't incapacitate me, because I was putting them to, I was involved in something that was greater than myself. There was a moment where, in the middle of one of those attacks, I realized, for me, how important art is. And that feeling from that time has stuck with me. And there's a lot of, never forget and all of that stuff. And I think, for me, everybody's different. I mean, this is all my opinion. I'm not suggesting what anybody should think or feel. But for me, I found myself, maybe after 10 years of being in this kind of melancholic, nostalgic mode around this time of year that stemmed from 9/11, I found myself choosing to forget. And that bothered me. But I realized that the experience is a part of who I am. And I think sometimes we do have to forget from the standpoint of holding on to certain ideas that we may have had about something in the past, or holding on to certain ways we were affected by something in the past, and restructure our perception of what happened. Not conjuring a truth or a new truth, but just telling the story differently. And I think for me, there was a lot of empowerment in doing that. And I don't get sad about it anymore. And I don't feel bad about it anymore. And there's a part of me that feels bad saying that. But what has replaced that confusion around, and that sadness around that time, is kind of a sense of duty to seek out that sense of humanity that I felt in the weeks and months following September 11, 2001. There is a part of me that really does believe that art and expression is kind of our last resort. And I've always been an optimist, many, many times to a fault. And there is this sense of the end right now. And it affects me. It makes me very anxious. I do not think the world's going to explode, but there is more of a sense of unknowing now than I have ever experienced. And I think we can choose to look at that two ways. We can be afraid of that. We can be frightened by that and kind of curl up in a ball, which admittedly I do sometimes. And I fight that. And other times there's the other side of it where we can engage that, where we can kind of create structures with our art, with our media, with how we share, with how we connect with people, both in person and digitally, that enlivens a dialogue that's not about the answers. Everybody has opinions. I don't think people are really talking. And, to that, everybody is screaming, but not everybody is being heard or listening, or has a structure to be heard or be listened to. And I think art really has the potential to help reintegrate that capability of ours, not just from a human standpoint, but from a technological one. I know I'm talking in kind of like, kind of being a little bit vague here, and I will get into it more as we evolve these episodes. I guess what I'm trying to say is, through all of the anxiety, I do still see it as excitement left unused. And I think that I'm feeling this influx of anxiety in the last couple of years, especially for some personal reasons, but also because of what is happening outside of myself. But ultimately, it is an excitement. We can change it up. And as finite and crippling as a lot of the things out there seem right now, I think we can also choose to see them as a time to start a new history. So, with that, I bid you adieu. Thank you for listening. I look forward to sharing more about this. I look forward to talking more about art and anxiety and all the other good stuff. So until then, be amazing. And if you're listening to this, I genuinely have love for you. I genuinely love you. That's one of my pet peeves, is when people say love you. And it can be written or it can be spoken. Own it. We are an I. If we just say love you, it's just kind of fluff. It's a cloud. But if we put that I there, and I understand that's intimate for people, some people, but I don't know if we're in a time where it should be anymore. I don't know. Talk to you when I do.